Welcome, everyone. This is Tristan McGough, your philosopher at large, and today we're going to embark upon intermediate selfology. And today we're going to consider finity, as in the finite, and company, unlimited. So we'll be dealing with finity, infinity, transfinity, afinity, and omnifinity. We'll break these down in just a moment. There's been much confusion about the idea of what constitutes infinity, for instance. And the only way that one can understand infinity is, of course, in contrast with the finite world, as I term it, finity. So let's take a quick look. And all of these concepts that we're dealing with here, and today we're going to look at the terms and limits of these terms of aseity, that is, of being in itself, these ways of being, finity, infinity, afinity, transfinity, and omnifinity. All of that, of course, fits somewhere here in the 7 intuitional ideas of self, which is what selfology is all about. It's the study in science and systematic theorizing of the self. And as we've spoken, the self is seen as one and all of 7 different facets. Everything, it's the all, or it's the one, it's the single, or it's the real, or it's the complete or the whole, including the minicosm and the microcosm and the macrocosm, as well as its cognos, that is, all the variations of intelligence and sentience and vivacience and conscience that goes into existence for any individual conscious being or entity. And then there's, of course, what we spoke of as the psychonaut, and that's the pilgrim. That's where everyone gets to a point where they awaken and they begin to consciously unfold their innate potential. And once that is perfected, that is the reason, the purpose that every individual comes to fulfill that purpose. Then they become a parousia, someone who is second born. And in that process, that awakening process, they consciously, deliberately, intentionally contribute to the world around them. Now, the ideas of finity and infinity and all the others of aseity, that is, in the very nature and ground of being itself, can be viewed from these different ideatic frames. Often when we're speaking of infinity, it's a mathematical concept, so I wanted to break down for us what actually we mean by these terms when they're being used. And they're rather all-inclusive, are they not? We're not just simply looking at the finite world, and we're not speaking of infinity as some kind of boundless, universal world of ideas or essences or principles or aspects, however you wish to conceive it. However, what we're doing instead, we're looking at all of these in relationship to one another so that we have a better handle upon what the nature of our own experience is. Our own experience is not only a finite experience, is it not? It is also a moment where we're taking what is infinite potential and we're turning it into a finite episode. This is regularly done, and one should not think that just because it seems as if the paper itself is not changing, that it is not part of the becoming of the world that is the finite world. The finite world is always becoming. It is always becoming what it innately is, and it is always becoming something which it never was not. So, it is moving from a world of potential being into actual being, and if you will, it's surfing upon the surface of being as manifestation, and that's the finite world. Our own experience is constituted of taking that infinite potential and pulling it down into finite events and episodes that we experience. However, make no mistake about it, when you're looking in the mirror in the morning, you looking as that the same individual in terms of a continuous consciousness and identity that you had when you were a teenager? Of course it is. You've seen the changes that have taken place, but in terms of a continuing consciousness or of a single mind stream, not for a moment have you ever released the thought that you were other than who you are. And that is the very nature of identity and self-identity. So let's take a look very briefly in terms of the finite. It's any quantity or entity that's limited or bounded or essentially that can be measured. So finite sets are specific, countable in size, right? Or shape. Everything has a limit. This page, this stand, this octahedron, this table and its cloth, all of it are finite objects, and they're made up, of course, of different elements. And all of these are particulars. And simply because we say that it looks as if that page is not becoming something else other than the page, of course it is. On a subatomic level, there's a great deal of motion that's taking place. And in terms of even the physical and chemical level, of course, the molecular bonds are breaking down. The paper in time will yellow, eventually wither, crumble into dust. So it is always in a state of change. Besides the pictures that we take of the finite world, in which we think that they're like a still life, when actually the motion camera of life takes us on a dynamic journey of which we never leave the center in which we have already arrived and are unfolding what it is that we are in a novel way. And that's the future. The future is something that's always unproduced. So when it arrives, it appears fresh. And that's the nature of serial causation, production, in the finite world. There is always something fresh that seems to be coming from the future, which is an untapped potential, but at the same time we're being hurled from the past. We carry with us our complete set of memories and impressions and all the episodes that we've arranged and sedimented in our lives, some of us tapping deeper layers than others and some of us preferring not to. So in terms of finity, examples of that are whole numbers, like 1, 2, 3, right? These are numbers which, in terms of cardinality, they're whole, they're not fractions, they're nothing but ordinally one following after another. 1, 2 follows 1, 3 follows 2, etc., etc., etc. And that can go on for an infinitude of counting or projected in mathematical space an infinity of whole numbers. Infinity itself is not being finite, in that infinity lacks all limits. It's unbounded. Where the finite world is bounded and has a size, the infinite world such as a world of putative universals, that is, general ideas that apply to all, such as redness, greenness, the various smells. These are all categories, and they have to exist in some essential form, that is, in a form, in order for that to take shape in the empirical world of finite objects. So, infinity is the complete lack of boundaries whatsoever. And infinity refers broadly to anything that exceeds finitude in extent or duration. So we're talking about space or time. It just keeps going and going and going and going. Of course, the problem, as we compare these two, is in a finite world where everything has shapes and sizes and some kind of span and dimension, duration, beginning, a span of duration, and then an ending, a resorption, a death, if you will. All of that happening in the finite world, even in a cyclic or a patterned way, is still finite. And there is some limit even to an expansive universe, because it's still finite. We use the concept of infinity to say that it's going to go on forever, it's going to always expand, as some theorists might propound. However, that full expansion itself is just an expansion of what already is. It has only so much energy in a universe. And so the alleged infinity of the universe is nothing more than an imaginative or an analogical application of the true notion of infinity, which is it's boundless. It's the same thing, but it's boundless. And that differs from afinity, which afinity is non-finity. It's nothing. It's dimensionless. The closest thing you can get to afinity is the point, because in Euclidean geometry and most other geometries, the point has no dimension. Well, if a point has no dimension, we're talking afinity. And if you're talking about a paraverse, such as with the omnifinity, where everything is expanded past infinities or even imaginable infinities, well, then you're talking something where the point is everywhere and the circumference is nowhere. However, transfinity is actually where you're taking, as a conscious being, the being of infinity, and translating, as it were, through vibration into finitude. You take the infinite and you bring it down to the finite world. And as we've spoken of in terms of omniphilosophy, what you're really doing is taking the spiritual self, or the agnostic self, which has infinite potential and is at one already in the greater scape of the universe. And you're taking that infinite potential, and as a transfinite being who has a continuing mind stream and is well aware of the other dimensions of self, including thinking and feeling and willing, etc. These 10 dimensions, that is the inner scape, and that's the epistic self. And that's the self that is the pivot, if I can. It is the pivot of your transfinite experiences. So transfinity is infinity becoming finity, is the infinite manifesting as the finite. Transfinity lies beyond the boundless horizon of conventional infinities and into unfathomably vast domains of consciousness. In this surreal world, the laws of logic and mathematics undergo radical transformation, and the limits of space, time, entity, causation, and possibility, and all the other modalities, the other 6 modalities as well, they all vanish and they vanish into a tapestry of ramified experience, because no experience that you have in the finite world is anything but limited. But no experience that you have as the agnostic or spiritual self in the greater scape is finite. It's all unlimited. It's all integrated into the greater scape already. It isn't something that you, as a transfinite being, have to do. You don't have to invent the laws of gravity in order to participate in them. In the same way, you don't have to invent the principles of the cosmos or of consciousness in order to be consciousness or part of that cosmos. So what we're talking about in terms of all 5 of these displays of aseity, of the way that being is in itself, we might entitle the Finite and Company. And I've listed it here so that we can just take a real quick look in terms of a tabular form of what we're speaking of in each of these terms. Pardon me. First of all, in terms of finity, we all know this from common sense, right? These are the things that are bounded and limited quantities, and in terms of mathematics, it's anything that can be measured and quantified, and it's the basis of the universe. Finity, the finite things, the basic things that science studies and that religion coheres into an understandable whole in terms of a big picture of oneness, and that art plays with in such fantastic variations in media, and that economics is involved in translating different concrete products and professional and other services into what? Into an abstract thing called currency. Some kind of economic, agreed upon, conventional value that can be passed as a kind of quantified economic indicator. That's all finity. Infinity, in terms of common sense, is the unbounded. It's the opposite of what's measurable. It's immeasurable. So it's anything that is not finite and continues forever, in layman's terms, without limit. It's the basis of the universe and the multiverse. What's the multiverse? Well, part of the basis of the multiverse is the same basis as this universe, which is hemmed in by its own causational nexus, and if you will, ring pass not. Right? What makes one universe whole and complete unto itself is that all of its laws of causality and entities and space and time, they, as an amalgam, work together to create that one eon as a universe. But how many of those exist? Each one encapsulated in its own samsaric sphere of cause, entity, space, and time. What happens there doesn't get affected here. However, in terms of transfinity, we all access that through our surreal imagery. That's the irreal nature of consciousness. And that's why you can use fictional notations that we call words, that we can manipulate. And sometimes they correctly correspond and describe reality. And at other times, as we've learned, we can use lexical legerdemain, and they don't correspond, but we can affirm that they do. And the declarative mind that listens to an affirmation by somebody else tends to reassert what they've just heard. Of course, if you have certain proclivities, your psychical proclivities, which are all transfinite, they carry from one event to another, from one episode to another. You don't get rid of them. You don't shirk your proclivities. You can change them. You can reduce the potency, the negative potency of your proclivities, and you can eliminate the negative parts of your proclivities. But you shall always have some kind of proclivities that have been built up in this finite world, that have been stored in the transfinite world, and, if you will, has effects upon everything else throughout infinity. So we already spoke of afinity, and that has both a mathematical and a philosophical domain of discourse. And that's the absence of any dimension whatsoever. As I said, it's like the point, it's zero. And now omnifinity, or absolute infinity, that's something altogether. That's ultimate infinity beyond formal mathematics. It's metaphysical concept of the paraverse. A speculative magnitude beyond all transfinite infinities. We might think of that in terms of the great paradox, when we state it in language, that can only be surmounted by paralogic, where A equals A is neither true nor false, but A equals A is the ground of all regardless. In terms of, let's take the other sheet of the absolute infinity, the omnifinite, and I'd like us to just look finally at this. Omnifinity might be depicted as a magnitude greater than any infinity or transfinity, beyond even the transfinite hierarchy. And its directionality is omnidimensional, including, as it does, the afinite, infinite, finite, and the transfinite. What I was looking for, of course, is that it also includes omnicity. It includes all the omnisciences. When we're speaking of omnifinity, absolute infinity, we're not talking about particular infinities such as the infinity of whole numbers, or the infinity of natural numbers, or the infinity of real numbers, or the infinity of pi going on as a continuing, non-repeating decimal. We're not talking about any of that. We're talking about things that are utterly beyond that and all at once. When you stop and think that in terms of serial causation, you're playing a game of billiards, for instance, you're keeping your eye on the ball and the balls, and they're bouncing all over. But however, we're the billiard balls in the game of life, and all of us are in the omniverse as parts, if you will, waves in this infinite ocean. And the wave that is cresting at one point in the ocean is in the very same ocean as all the other waves that are cresting or troughing, or that are creating the network and the pattern and the shape of the universe in which we inhabit. But when we're speaking about all the various aspects of aseity, from finity through infinity and transfinity and afinity, all the way to omnifinity, we're speaking of what essentially is being knowing itself. We'll end today with the 6 omnicities of consciousness, that is, of conscious being. When we're talking about omniscience, up here I've got it represented in our tetrahedron. We're talking about all intuiting, all the world at once, and all its transfinite tapestries that are in dynamic flow, interacting and ramifying against one another in unforeseen ways, and ways which the rational mind can't really comprehend any more than it comprehends all the rational and irrational and whole numbers in their infinite sets all at once paying attention. That's not the human empiric mind. The epistic mind is able to hold, the epistic self and its mind is able to hold all these things together that has been experienced as episodes and weave them together into a meaningful tapestry, which, as we spoke of, is a message that bears uncovering and recovering. So here we have all-knowing, which is omniscience. That's part of omnicity. But there's also, what else? Omnidurance. That's the all-enduring. And if we look at each one of these, omniscience, that's the all-embracing. Omnipresence, that's the all-present. Omnipotence, that's the all-powerful, the one that can do absolutely everything. We mentioned the omnidurance, that's the all-enduring. But besides that, there is the Almighty, and of course, inexhaustible being is the all-creative omnifacience. These are the aspects to infinite conscious being as understood in terms of omnifinity. Can we conceptualize that clearly? Well, you shouldn't be able to unless you have omnicity. Up until that point, the concepts are all like rungs on the ladder. Each one helps you to deepen your noetic experience of the world in which you live and the world in which we all live and move and have our being as we transform ourselves for either the betterment or for the worse, part of our conscious natures. Either way, we are one way or another participating in the world. So it is very important to understand that even though we have a finite existence, we have a transfinite reality where we are living as conscious beings that have a living dimension and a feeling dimension and a thinking dimension and a willing dimension and an observing dimension and a continuing dimension, a unifying dimension, an advancing dimension through self-presencing, and ultimately the foundation upon which all of it is grounded, an identifying dimension. So until the next time, my friends, behave when you must, be good whenever you can, but above all else, be yourself.